Hello YouTube, how are you all doing? I hope you're doing fantastically fabulous today. If you're not doing fantastically fabulous, burn some incense. Incense always make me feel fantastically fabulous when I don't feel fantastically fabulous. Today's topic that I wanted to talk about was a particular type of entity that I've never heard talked about. When you think of entities on YouTube, in the witchy sphere, you think of Hecate, the Morrigan. Is it the Sphinx? No, I don't know. There's a cat goddess out there that gets talked about. There's a few other types of gods and goddesses that get talked about, but when we talk about entities on YouTube, we talk about Morrigan and Hecate, right? We talk about demons, and we talk about spirits, and we talk about hauntings, and we talk about our experiences with those hauntings, and our experiences in places that are to be haunted, and so on and so forth. But the one thing we don't really talk a lot about is death. Not the physical death, but the magical death. Death in magic. We also really don't talk about death, the figure, the entity, the conjured image of what we perceive death to look like. The skeleton in a cloak or robe, or a pale man on a horse, or whatever the case may be. Maybe you've got some tarot cards or drawings or paintings or whatever, right? Skulls, or a form of or a representation of death, dead plants, dead animals, dead anything, obviously. But what about in witchcraft? Where does death come in witchcraft? Well, I have a video called Death is an Illusion, but that's coming out later. I finally found time to schedule those videos that I've put together, and they'll come out at some point. I've got them scheduled for some point. I just can't remember it off the top of my head. But when we think about death, we think of the physical and the emotional pain and grief that it brings us, but we don't really think about the witchy side of death. Death in magic isn't really about the death of a thing, like a person, a living, breathing thing. We think of death as death of habits, death of a relationship, death of a job, death of, right? When we think of cursing and hexing, we want to cause death, not in the physical sense, obviously, right? But through intention. We want something in that person's life to die, whether it be rapidly or slowly over time, right? And for the person to suffer, right? Because death brings on an emotional response in all of us. Death of a job, death of a loved one, death of a pet, so on and so forth. Magic dies, sort of. So it fizzles, right? When we do protection magics, when we do protection magics, or when we do wards, or we do seals, or we do enchantments on things, right? The magic from that slowly breaks down over time. If we create servitors, I mean, it doesn't have to, but eventually you will get rid of the servitor should you want to, right? Let's say you make a servitor for something, it fulfills its use case, you get rid of it, that's a death, right? So when we think about death in witchcraft, the one thing that I've never really seen talked about is death as an entity. I was on TikTok a little while ago, and I saw a conversation around this witch proclaiming to be a death witch. She works with dead things like bones and animal spirits and zombies and skeletons, and I'm like, okay, whatever. And she's very into necromancy and really like we would perceive as the darker aspects of witchcraft. And she said that she works with death. And I was like, oh. And then I thought, can you? Can you work with death? Like, what would death bring you? And then I thought about it and I was like, on a shadow working kind of path where there's a lot of shadow work involved in you and you're using a lot of magic in your shadow work, you could easily work with death, right? But as a general, like a deity, like the Morrigan or Hecate, right? Because when we think about these entities, we have to think about what is it that they're bringing us. Sometimes people talk about the Morrigan bringing money, prosperity spells with the Morrigan, or love spells with Hecate, right? But does death bring love or money? I don't know. Like, I can't really see myself working with death and being like, I need money. Protection, maybe. Right? Conjuring walls of spirits, armies of spirits surrounding you. But again, I see death mostly being worked with as a temporary entity in terms of shadow work, not so much in terms of like everyday witchcraft. But there's nothing wrong with it. I'm just wondering, from a practical standpoint, what could death bring you? Aside from death. I mean, it'd be worse than the Morrigan. Hi, death, I want some change. Okay, everything in your life is dead. The Morrigan sort of makes everything in your life dead. She just, I don't know, there's an elegance about the way she makes everything in your life dead. When she's like, oh, you need change now. Death to this. Right? So I just wanted to kind of have this conversation around death and witchcraft and, you know, kind of around the idea of working with death as an entity in witchcraft and getting your thoughts and opinions on that, because I don't really know where I stand on it. I'm not saying that it's not right or it's wrong or it's anything like that. I'm just kind of curious. Have any of you worked with death? Right? I mean, we kind of work with death. I mean, if you work with spirits, right? Spirits of the dead, ancestors, right? We kind of work with death. But I'm talking about death like the pale horse, right? The skeleton man, working with him as an entity. I mean, you could have demons as entities. And there's demons for everything. You want to learn languages, there's demons for that. You want money, there's demons for that. You want love, there's demons for that. But I guess it kind of boils down to is like, what does death do? If it's not shadow work, right? And you're not doing completely baneful magics all the time, and you're not really protecting yourself every day of the week, what else can death do for you? Maybe he could be like one of those like matron patron, right? You might maybe have him as a patron, and then for your matron you have somebody else who brings in money, and right, and then you can use death for like, oh, I'm going to curse you, and then you could use this fairy pixie, this fairy pixie dragon. I don't know. What are you kids into these days? Use that for your money and your prosperity and all of that stuff, right? So I just kind of want to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on death, and not death in a physical sense, but in a witchcraft, in a witchy kind of sense. Do you have a connection with death? Do you work with death? Do you use animal parts? Tell me about death.